My name is Michal Szynkiewicz. I'm from the Thorntail team at Red Hat. I'll be talking today about Thorntail, our micro implementation of Eclipse MicroProfile. I will start from an intro about MicroProfile itself. So, MicroProfile is a community initiative to define Java specifications to address cloud problems, let's say. So, it is a collaboration between Red Hat, IBM, Payara, Tommy Tribe, and lots of others, even Oracle. And currently, MicroProfile has a specification for exposing REST APIs, dependency injection, manipulating JSON, configuring applications, securing them, fault tolerance, measuring what's going on in the application, exposing information about your API, for a REST client, for distributed tracing, and for checking the health of your application. It's evolving quite rapidly. It has 3 releases a year. This year, MicroProfile 1.4 and 2.0 were released in June, I think. And they contained config, fault tolerance, JWT, OpenTracing, REST client, metrics, Open API, health check, and also JSON CDI in JSON-P. This is what 1.4 contained. 2.0 updated CDI, JSON and JSON-P, and also added JSON-B. And just a couple days back, there was MicroProfile 2.1 released, and it updated OpenTracing. In February 2019, we expect to have MicroProfile 2.2, which will update lots of specifications and possibly also add 2 more reactive messaging and reactive streams. There is also some work being done on long-running actions, so a way to compensate for processing of a request, of a distributed processing of a request that failed at some point, MicroProfile concurrency, and MicroProfile service mesh. Let me go into a bit more detail about these specifications. So for configuring applications, we have MicroProfile config. With MicroProfile config, you can inject the configuration values with CDI, like here with inject, but you can also get them programmatically, and you can define these values in a properties file in your application, but you can override the values with an environment variable or with Java system properties. You can also provide custom config sources. So, for example, if you use Kubernetes and want values from a config map, you can do it your own way. This is config. Another building block of MP is the REST client. With it, you can, based on JSON interface, you can build let's call it a stub of a client. You can then inject it into your application, or you can also create it programmatically. It's built on top of JSON 2.0 client API, so you can add JSON converters or interceptors to that. MicroProfile client also adds a response exception mapper, so you can map some erroneous responses, like, for example, 404, to Java exceptions, like, I don't know, not found exception. And it also can be asynchronous. Another thing is MicroProfile OpenTracing. This is for distributed tracing. Distributed tracing is about tracking what's going on with your requests. If you have multiple services, then it's not that obvious as in a big application. If you add MicroProfile OpenTracing to your project, you can then connect it to, for example, Jaeger, and you will get something like here below, where you can see how much time was spent where, and also some additional information about what was going on with the request. It is also customizable with annotations. It can work with Jaeger, Hocklore, Datadog, and more. There are 2 important things to remember about it. One is it requires a server-specific dependency, because the Jaeger collector works differently than, for example, Hocklore collector. So you'd have to add something to talk with the collector. And unfortunately, currently doesn't work out of the box with MicroProfile REST client. but I should be able to show you how to make it work with Thorntail today. Another specification is MicroProfile Open API. With it, you can easily expose documentation for your REST endpoints. If you just add the MicroProfile Open API to your project, then it will expose some sensible information about your API on /OpenAPI endpoint, but you can also customize this info with annotations. With OpenAPI is generally a standard for documenting REST endpoints. You can consume it with a Swagger UI if you know Swagger. You can also generate a client based on that. There was a talk about it yesterday. Another thing is MicroProfile JWT or JOT authentication. It stands for JSON Web Token. JSON Web Token is a concept where you have some JSON data defining things like roles of a user and username, and this data is signed by a trusted authority. And then if you have, I don't know, 20 services, each of the services can know public key of a trusted authority and can verify the signature itself. So you don't have to go to the trusted authority from each service to verify if the security token is correct. And then you can use, with MicroProfile JWT, with such token, you can use the common security annotations like roles allowed to limit the access for an endpoint, for example, to specific roles. You can also, of course, inject the whole token into your CDI bean or just a part of it, or use the Jaxer security context to access the token. Another thing is MicroProfile Matrix. This is for checking out what's going on in your application. Metrics are exposed on /metrics endpoint. By default, there are two metric scopes. One is base. Every vendor has to provide a set of basic metrics like garbage collector stats or thread count. There are also vendor-specific metrics that go under vendor scope. And if you define your own metrics, they will go into /metrics/application. MicroProfile metrics expose data in Prometheus or JSON format. If you use Prometheus format, you can connect it to the Prometheus server, which is able to show some, let's call it a dashboard, with what's going on in your application. You can define some alerts on some invalid state, let's say, or if you see there's something wrong going on with your application. Another part of MicroProfile is MicroProfile Tolerance. With this microservice architecture, you have to be more careful when writing your code, because having multiple services usually deployed in the cloud, you're much more exposed to problems with networking, for example. And MicroProfile Tolerance addresses this problem. From my point of view, the most basic element of fault tolerance is a timeout. So you can specify a timeout on a method call, and it will just fail if the timeout is reached. But you can also specify a retry. If you add a retry on a method that has a timeout, then after the timeout is reached, it will be retried. But you can add a retry on different methods as well, not only those having a timeout. You can specify maximum number of retries, how long should application wait before retrying. You can also say that you want wait a random, some random time. Max duration of all the retries, or you can even say that you want to retry on some specific exception and abort on another. You can also specify a fallback. So if something fails, you can say do this instead of calling this service. And there's also circuit breaker. Circuit breaker is for the situations where you have a service and it starts to fail. It may fail, for example, because it is under too heavy load. So if there are lots of failures and if you define a circuit breaker, the circuit breaker will open, and it means that the request will no longer go to the service that was failing. And after some specified time, the communication will be retried, and if it's successful on a number of consecutive attempts, then the circuit breaker would get fully closed and the request will just normally go through. Another thing is asynchronous. So if you just put it on a method, it will make it asynchronous, but you can also use it, for example, with bulkhead. So bulkhead, generally, if you just put a bulkhead on a method, it will limit the number of concurrent invocations of the method. And but if you mix it with asynchronous, it will introduce a queue for the calls. So this way, you will get an isolated thread pool for the calls, and you can isolate any potential failure of a different system, so that it won't. So that the fact that you are trying to access it won't eat up all the threads that you have in your system, in your service. And there's also MicroProfile Health, a relatively simple one, in my opinion. It just exposes information if your system, if your service is healthy or not. You can also drop in your own health checks that will say if the disk is full, for example. It can be leveraged by service mesh. I will show that tomorrow on my another talk when I will mix MicroProfile with cloud native stuff. We hopefully know what MicroProfile is. Now, Thorntail is our implementation of MicroProfile. It can be viewed as an application generator. You add it to your application, and it will pack the things you want from Thorntail with your code into a fat jar. You can also use a concept of a hollow jar, so that you will have a jar with your server, and then you can have a WAR file with your code. It will also work together. Currently supports MicroProfile 3. We plan to jump to MicroProfile 2.0 soon. It's configured via YAM, has helpers for testing, has lots of features that I don't have time to go through now. And I wanted to jump to demo now to show you how it works in practice. Oh, sorry. So to show you that, I wrote a simple application. Oh, sorry. I will start it in the background and take a quick tour through it. So it exposes a single resource. It's exposed on /quotes, produces JSON. Are these letters big enough, or would it be better black and white? Then it's okay. So yeah, a single endpoint. The endpoint returns a list of quotes, and on top of, because we all want to earn on what we do, on top of the quotes, it will add a single advertisement. It has started, so it looks like this. So there's an advertisement, and there are 3 quotes underneath. This curl JSON is just a wrapper on curl that I wrote that makes it colorful and adds the accepts and content type headers. Okay. So I will first show you how to add MicroProfile Open API to this project, so that we have a documented endpoint. I'll quickly restart the server and go through the POM with you. Okay. Yeah, sure. So this is how a normal Thorntail application would be configured in a Maven file. What's important is the packaging. It should be a WAR file. And then we have a BOM file, which is optional, but will bring versions of all the available Thorntail elements that you can choose from. Before, I had just JAX-RS, CDI, and Undertow. from Thorntail. What is cool about it is that you pick these elements as normal Maven dependencies. You don't have to have some XML definition, for example, for that. And I just added MicroProfile Open API. There's also an option to specify that you want all the MicroProfile pieces together, but you can choose what you want. And there's one more important part about it. Thing about it is it's the Thorntail Maven plugin. This is the plugin that generates the fudger. So yeah, it restarted. Let's go and query the Open API endpoint. Yeah, so we got a JSON output, but we can also get a YAM output, which will be easier to read probably. So we had this REST quotes endpoint, and as you see, there's a REST quotes path here. It says that the server can respond with 200 and return an array of objects that have author, content, and URL. Okay, this is the basic stuff, but we can also customize it. We can add an operation annotation, for example, and within the operation we can specify a description for a method. Quotes, for example. We can say it's deprecated. We can even hide it from this information. We can also add information like available API responses to that, or document any parameters that go into this endpoint. There's that. We can also, so there's this add, sorry, it's not that. There's this quote object that's returned by the endpoint, and we can also add some information to that. So we can, for example, go with schema here and say that this is an optional URL to redirect a user to. Or we can give an example, HTTP example.com. Okay. And I'll quickly restart the server. Okay. Do you have some questions so far? Because we have a few seconds. Yep.
In your POM, when you specify like undertow and stuff as Maven dependencies, are those provided by the Thorntail runtime, or do they end up in your WAR file?
They are in the Thorntail part. They're not mixed mixed into your WAR file. The WAR file won't have it. Oh, actually, the WAR file generated by the Maven by Maven might have it, but we strip it down. Yeah, I'll show you the target directory. Maybe it will be easier. So after a build, we're getting quotes WAR file, which should not have these Thorntail elements, and there is also our original WAR file that should have it. It would probably have it.
Okay, so that's what you mean by hollow WAR. Is like it starts off big and then you plug in pulls.
A whole jar is a different concept, so we can talk about it later. Okay. Okay, so I customized it a bit, and let's see what happened here. So we have description added. It got deprecated, and there is a description here, an example. Yep. Okay, let's jump to the metrics. So to mimic some computations, I added a processor class here. If you take a look at the getQuotes method, it calls the processor process here. On this process, I will add some metrics. So I could just count the invocations of process, but I can, oh, sorry, I forgot about adding it to the POM. That's why it ain't working. So here it is, MicroProfile Matrix. And in a minute, I will be able to use it when it actually picks it up. So yeah, I can add the basic metrics I would get with timed annotation, metered annotation, but I want to get a bit more. I also want to get some time statistics, so I'll add a timed annotation. Timed contains everything that metered contains, but adds also time statistics. And I can also specify some application-specific, it's called gauge. So I can have a method that just returns some value. And if I want to put this value into my metrics, I can define a gauge on that. So let's do that. For gauge, I have to specify a unit. Let's call it minis. This processor just sleeps for some time, and then it returns. And this get total processing time will add, which will return the total time of waiting for all the requests that were done. I mentioned counted, I mentioned metered, I mentioned a gauge. Okay, it restarted, so let's go here. Metrics are available under /metrics. So this is the Prometheus format of metrics, but it's not very user readable. But if you curl it with JSON headers, you will get info in this way. Let's call our application and to get some information about the application metrics. Okay, now we should have some application-specific metrics here. So there is vendor-specific metrics, base metrics, and our application metrics. The total processing time was 3 seconds, and there were 6 calls. It took 0.8 requests per second in the last 15 minutes, I think. Okay, there are some statistics here. Yeah, this is how it works, basically. Another thing I wanted to show is MicroProfile REST client. So currently, when I get an ad, I just mock it locally. I have an ad retriever class that just mocks an ad and returns something like that I predefined. But I wrote a different service that is able to provide a random ad. Okay, let's do it here. I did something wrong with my shell. It's not working, sorry.
You need a space after curl? Curl dash JSON?
It's okay, I just didn't start the ads application. So let me do that. Okay, in the meantime, I will start coding the REST client part. So as I said, for the REST client, I need an interface annotated with JAX REST annotations. So let me start from that, and let's call it maybe add client. It will be an interface. Okay, so here is that. In the meantime, it started, so let me show you what it returns. It returns a single advertisement with some content and with an URL. And it coincidentally, I just have an add class that defines exactly the same fields, content and URL, so I will reuse that. The data is exposed at /ads. It is JSON data, so let me add this info here. Oh, sorry, not this media type. Yep, application JSON, and I will add MicroProfile REST client to my application. And now I will define the get method. So it will return an ad, and let's call the method the get ad. It is a get method, and that's it from the interface. I hope it's clear what's going on here. Now I need to build a client from that. What I could do is I could add an annotation here called register REST client something like that. And then I would have a REST client available on CDI, but I will do it programmatically. It would be easier for me later on. So let's create an add client here. Oops. Okay. And create it with REST client builder post construct. So client equals REST client. We have a MicroProfile REST client brings something called REST client builder. It requires a base URL for your service, and you build it from an interface. So add client class. If I do that, then instead of mocking an add here in the get add method, I should be able to do this client get add. Now I need to provide base URL somehow. I could hard code it, but I will use MicroProfile config for that. With MicroProfile config, I can inject the URL. It has a how do you call it? It can map a string to a URL itself, so I can use URL here. Add service URL, let's call it. And I have to say that I want to inject it. And it is a config property. I cheated a bit, and I already defined MicroProfile config properties. This is the default place for looking for proper MicroProfile config properties. So yeah, let me reuse this file. Yeah, so okay. I will inject the property called add service URL in here, and I will use it here. Okay, well, let's restart the server. Any questions? No questions. Okay, it's ready. Let's code for quotes. Oh, it worked. And before, we were getting this ad about Thorntail v4, and now we got a different advertisement for Thorntail. But if I try a couple more times, yeah, I got an advertisement for Open Liberty. Thorntail again. Payara. Yeah. Okay. What I'd like to show you now, seems I still have time, is how to trace it. So I already have a Jaeger server working, and I will drop in Jaeger into my application. So where is it? I will use MicroProfile OpenTracing, obviously, but I will use also the Jaeger specific part that I mentioned when talking about MicroProfile OpenTracing. Unfortunately, I need some Thorntail specific config for that. I have written a script that will copy that for me. I don't need this part, but I will leave it. When I was practicing, I was using this URL. So by default, it would send the traces on a proper port, but let's leave it for now. Okay. Okay, so we have MicroProfile OpenTracing in the project. We have Jaeger. Unfortunately, as I also mentioned, it is not enough for the call to the inner service, let's call it, to be traced. For that, you have to add a specific feature. In Thorntail, it is called small ROI client tracing feature. And this small ROI client tracing feature has to have a tracer passed. So let's inject a tracer. here, and let's pass it here. Okay, and let's restart the application. Now we have a quotes application that calls a ads application. So we should be able to see a trace going through both application and then going back in the Jaeger UI. Okay, it started. So let's do a couple requests. Maybe a single request should be enough. Okay. Okay, Jaeger quotes showed up here. Do you see these letters? Should I make it a bit bigger? Okay, let's increase it. Okay, so we have quotes here. Let's find trace. There's a trace here. So this is the get that entered Thorntail. Then Thorntail called the ad service. Ad service took 0.88 milliseconds, and then Thorntail, quotes took much more because of the processor probably. Okay, I think I'll finish the demo on that and go back here because I'm running out of time. Yep. If you're interested in that, don't miss my tomorrow's talk. I will be showing how to deploy it all on Kubernetes, and I will be also showing some other specifications from MicroProfile. Here are some links. The letters are probably, again, too small. First one is for this demo. I have it on GitHub. Then you have Thorntail, SmallRye. SmallRye is our implementation of MicroProfile. So if you are planning to add MicroProfile to a server, if you develop a server, I encourage you to try to use SmallRye. If you're interested in MicroProfile itself, here is a web page for MicroProfile, but also Google Forms for MicroProfile. And this one is quite interesting. MicroProfile calendar. It's open. If you want to join some discussions on some specifications, just go to the calendar and check where the meetings are. When the meetings are, there are also usually minutes for the meetings in the calendar events, so you can check that. Okay. Do you have any questions? Because I think we still have 2 minutes. Yeah.
The metric configuration, is there a way to push the metrics somewhere so you have a URL when you can fetch them, but is there also a way to, so let's say, push them every minute somewhere? Let's say.
I don't think MicroProfile has a way to push the metric somewhere, but for example, with Prometheus, you can configure it to access this endpoint from time to time, and it will gather this information. Yeah, I could have shown that. Okay. Any other questions? Thank you.